We'll begin in a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 42nd Annual Winter Lecture Series, Global Perspectives. This year's theme is Envisioning a Resilient Future. I'm Peter Levitoff, Chair of the Planning Committee. Other members of the committee are Dick Deanspear, Shedid Sait, Chuck and Barbara Francis, David Forsyth, Parks Coble, Amira Ibrahim Pasic, and Priscilla Handy. Jason Slaughter will oversee the technical aspects of the Zoom delivery of the series. And by the way, we'll use the same Zoom link for all 4 lectures and also the panel discussion on the 5th Sunday. Governments around the world have responded with different degrees of commitment to carbon reduction. As individuals, we often recognize the imminent threat of climate change with a sense of helplessness. There seems to be nothing we can do alone that will make a substantive difference. Moving away from a narrow focus on carbon reduction, however, the speakers in this series will provide hope by focusing on solutions which build communities and address the challenges of shelter, food, and sustainability. The activists and experts in the final panel will inform us on local issues and how we can each play a part in resolving them. Today and for the following 3 weeks, we look at different aspects of the topic. To help us understand and guide us through the issue, we have a distinguished group of speakers from across the country. Let me briefly outline our 4 sessions. Today, Sunday, February 16th, Dr. Barb Boustead, a climatologist with the National Weather Service, will provide an overview from her perspective of the coordinator for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA's new Climate Ready Nation program. Next Sunday, February 23rd, Dr. Tim Cruz, Chief Scientist and International Program Director and Director of Ecological Intensification at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, will speak on regenerative agriculture. The third week, Sunday, March 2nd, Dr. John Eichert, a retired professor of agricultural economics at the University of Missouri, will speak briefly on sustainable economics and then hold a conversation with Nebraska Emeritus Professor Chuck Francis on that topic. And in the fourth week, March 9th, Dr. Elizabeth Son, who is the founder and director of the Multi-Solving Institute and co-founded Climate Interactive in 2010 and led the scientific team that offered the first assessment of the sufficiency of country pledges to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate, will speak on multi-solving, and she'll also engage with Peter Hind and Mark Skolnick of Lincoln's low-income energy-efficient rental rehab program. The fourth week, Sunday, March 16th, there'll be the fifth week, there'll be a live on-site panel discussion comprised of local experts committed to finding solutions to climate changes right here in Lincoln. The panel will include Kim Morrow, the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Lincoln, Brandon Cobb, Indigenous Partnership Program Manager for Nature Conservancy in Omaha, Mark Broman, Executive Director of the Wachiska Audubon Society here in Lincoln, and Gene Hanlon, founder and coordinator of the Coalition for Environmental Improvement here. As has been the case for well over 20 years, the Winter Lecture Series is sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. In the early years, it was a program of the Vine Congregational Church in Lincoln. The program is brought to you with financial support from Humanities Nebraska, a statewide nonprofit organization helping Nebraskans explore what connects us and what makes us human. Additional support has been provided by the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. We also partner with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, known familiarly as OLLI, which aids us with publicity by weekly email announcements to its more than 1,700 members, putting the Winter Lecture Series in its course schedules and mentioning it in classes. Most of the people on the series planning committee are OLLI members. As you think of questions or comments, please put them in the chat box. If the chat moderator, Jason Slaughter, deems it appropriate, you may be able to ask your question live by unmuting your microphone. But for the time being, please be sure your microphone is muted. Jason will let you know about this at the end of the lecture. We expect each session to be precisely 90 minutes, so we'll end at 8:30 Central Time. The panel discussion will be at a different time. It'll be on the fifth Sunday, but it will be in the afternoon, March 16th, from 3 o'clock until 4:30 at the Unitarian Church in Lincoln, which, if you don't know, is located at 6300 A Street. If you miss a lecture, each one will be posted within a week on the Unitarian YouTube channel. If you're not already on the list to receive Winter Lecture Series reminders, go to the series website, which you can find on the Unitarian Church's website, unitarianlincoln.org. So please check and be sure you're muted and your video is off so the full bandwidth can be available to the speaker. And now on with the show. It's my pleasure now to introduce Don Wilhite, who will introduce our speaker. Don is Professor Emeritus of Applied Climate Science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's the former director of the School of Natural Resources and also the founding director of the International Drought Information Center and the International Drought Mitigation Center. And now I'll turn it over to Don, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks also to everyone who's online for this presentation. Maybe before introducing the speaker, let me go back to the theme for this particular series this winter, envisioning a resilient future. Resilience is a term that we use a lot. It's a term that we apply to things in our daily lives and so on, and with our families and so forth. But in the last decade or so, resilience is used an awful lot in the context of climate. For 10,000 years or so, we've had a relatively stable climate on planet Earth. But since the Industrial Revolution, and particularly over the last 100 to 150 years, our climate has grown increasingly unstable. And so we hear much more now the term climate resilience and how we're going to become more resilient to the frequency and severity of extreme climatic events, recovery from those events, and so on. So climate resilience has really become a dominant theme, I think, in the literature, but also in the media and so forth. So With that in mind, I invited our keynote speaker tonight, Barb Boustead, who is a meteorologist and climatologist who worked with the National Weather Service for many, many years. Barb is a friend, a colleague, and also a former student with the School of Natural Resources. She received her PhD in Natural Resources Climate Assessment and Impacts at UNL, and her dissertation was titled The Hard Winter of 1880, 1881, Climatological Context and Communications via the Laura Ingalls Wilder narrative. And she has a forthcoming nonfiction book called Wilder Weather, which draws further on what we can learn from weather and climate of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books and life. She's been an author of both the fourth and the fifth National Climate Assessment. So tonight she's going to talk about and give us an overview from her perspective of her career in climate, weather, and communication. So with that, I will turn it over to Barb.
Thank you so much, Don. And I'm grateful for the invitation to be here. I am quite impressed with the number of people who are spending time on a Sunday evening, firing up Zoom and listening to talks about resilience and climate and what we can do to build a better future. So I really appreciate everybody who's on this call and here to listen and engage about this. I'm going to start with just a bit of background about myself because I feel like if I'm going to talk to you all for the next hour or so, you should probably know a little more about where I come from, both literally and sort of metaphorically, figuratively. Gosh, where to start? So, as Don said, I was a PhD recipient from the University of Nebraska. I'm actually from Michigan originally, and I grew up there, went to Central Michigan University for my undergraduate degrees, and then on to Penn State for a master's degree before I started my career. And I do want to be clear, by the way, because I need to. I am here representing myself and my entire background, not the organization or organizations for which I work. I am here on my own to present my perspectives. But that said, I began a career in federal civil service back in 2002. And though I did work with the National Weather Service for 22 years. A lot of my work focused on the climate side of the National Weather Service's mission. I spent a few years in our headquarters. I spent 13 years as just a regular old weather forecaster, but always working on climate projects locally. And that included 10 years at the Omaha Valley office. So, for those of you who are in the Lincoln area, when you get that crawl on the screen that says the National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning, for about 10 years, that was me. Um, while I was at that office, that is when I went back for the PhD from the University of Nebraska. And I think being an adult, sort of return to school type of person, gave me a sense of more of what I wanted to accomplish with that degree. And what I wanted to accomplish was not only technical knowledge about climate and applied climatology, but how important it was to communicate climate and climatology. Because there are so many challenges that face us in the future, not just for our futures and the places we care about for our children's future. That's my little guy there who's that was several years ago now, but I just love that picture, contemplating life on the rocks by a lake there. Um, and it's his future I'm thinking about as I'm working on climate and what kind of a place we're going to leave for him. But one of the things I found in that work that I have done is how people will really resonate with information when you tell them a story, right? Um, and a lot of you know this already. Anybody who ever has sat down with a group knows that if you just threw a list of facts at somebody, even if they like you very much, probably it's going in one ear and out another. But when you connect it to something they care about, then they pay attention, then they remember things. I stumbled on this Laura Ingalls Wilder project by accident because I got to digging in a rabbit hole of the long winter and what had happened in the winter of 1880 to 1881 that Laura wrote about. And, was it as bad as she said and things like that. I thought it would be kind of fun to present it to a group of people who, and yes, there is actually this kind of a group of people who um, are academics in the world of Laura Ingalls Wilder or have done lifelong research, biographers, for instance, historians. And what I found when I gave that presentation, when I talked to them about weather and connected it to Laura Ingalls Wilder, they were fascinated. They asked a bunch of questions. It was one of the most engaged audiences I had ever spoken with. And I really wanted to dig into why. And the why, of course, was because I had connected weather and climate to something they cared very much about, which was Laura Ingalls Wilder. Um, and it turns out that that's a pretty good technique for talking to people. So, this idea of communicating about the weather and helping people understand where it intersects with their lives and why they might want to care about it really is that driving force behind what I have done throughout my career and where I have developed my expertise. And so I'm going to talk to you from those perspectives. Um, I mostly am going to talk about that communication side. I'll give just a little sort of basic climate information because it helps me tell the story that I want to tell. That said, if you do have questions that are more on the sort of the sciencey side of climate change, I am happy to help answer those. I'm sure Dawn could help too. But I have some sort of buried slides that I'm not going to show that can help support that information too. But I'm going to kind of skim over that stuff here because I think what you all want to get at isn't so much that climate is changing, but what do I say to people about this and how do we build a community that can do something about this? So let's get going on that, shall we? Um, so I mentioned these books that became such an important part of my story and why I wanted to pursue them. Because in this story of the long winter, uh, there are a number of things that happen that provide narratives, that provide places where we can communicate about weather and climate. And it covers a number of things, right? And through the narrative of the long winter. And by the way, just for fun, if you know how to use the React on Zoom, can you throw some kind of react on? I don't care. It could be smiley face or a thumbs up. If you have ever read the books or watched the TV show or are just kind of familiar with Laura Ingalls Wilder and her stories, I'm just sort of curious. I see some out there. There we go. Laugh, react. That's a good one. Thank you. Great. So, for those who aren't as familiar, Laura Ingalls Wilder was an author who wrote historical fiction based on her childhood. They are works of fiction, but they are also based to some extent quite a bit on her own experiences. So, some parts of the books are very historically accurate, others are fictionalized completely. And there are a whole lot of people who really enjoy studying which pieces are which. And for my little area of this interest, the piece I was looking at first in The Long Winter and then in her other books was when she talked about the weather, was she exaggerating? Was it fictionalized? Or was it what really happened in her lifetime? And although I don't want to totally give my forthcoming book away, the spoiler alert is that she actually did a really good job of accurately depicting weather events from her time in these places. So she described this terribly long winter, an incredible amount of snow, blizzard after blizzard. And it turned out that that winter was really quite severe. She lived in east central South Dakota at the time, or at least what's now South Dakota. And by some estimates, something like 130 to 150 inches of snow fell through that winter. Now, I know it's snowier in South Dakota than it is here, but um, the record that we have for measured snowfall in their periods of record up there is something like 80 inches. So even by South Dakota standards, that would be almost double what is currently known to be a record snowfall based on measurements. It really was an extreme winter. So when we learn that the winter really was as harsh as Laura's memory and her stories in the long winter, we can talk about all kinds of other things, like how do we get information to protect ourselves ahead of a winter like that? Are we more vulnerable to winter conditions now, uh, compared to the people who lived on the plains in Laura's time? And one of my favorites, could a long winter just like that one happen again? And if so, what would it take to make it happen? Because the climate was so much colder in the 1880s than it was now. But we'll get to more of this in a little bit. Um, Let me do some other things here. And I'm going to try to not do this to you, which is to fire hose you with a bunch of information. But I do want to give just a little background so that I know we're speaking the same language. So I'll start with one of my favorites, which is the difference between and connections between weather and climate. So when we think about weather events, you might just sort of think of one in your head. If I say, what is a weather event for you, or what are some types of weather that you might experience? You might think of things like a tornado, a blizzard, hail, the high temperature of the day, maybe a flash flood that comes up. Um, you might think of a long heat wave or a cold spell. But after a while, you start getting into these longer time periods. And then I might ask you, what is a climate event? How do you envision what climate looks like? Well, maybe you picture something like the Dust Bowl. Maybe you picture those graphs we've seen of temperature lines going up and up, or ice extent going down and down. If you're really nerdy like Don and I, you might picture an El Nino event like the one in the upper right corner picture. You might think about temperature and precipitation being, warmer than normal or drier than normal. The thing about weather is that it is tangible and visible. You can take a picture of it. You can touch it in the case of things like precipitation. You can feel those temperatures on your skin. Climate, by definition, is the statistics over a long period of time, right? Can't touch it as easily, can't see it and take a picture of it as easily. For that reason, that's one reason anyway. It can be harder to talk about climate than weather because if you say, "Ooh, look at that cloud, that lightning," people see it and viscerally understand it. But to say, doesn't it feel like temperatures have gone up 5 degrees in the last 30 years? That's really, really hard for a human to process that. So it already puts an obstacle up to us about how to talk about climate compared to weather, just because it's not so visceral and tangible to us. And I love analogies too. So there are some times where it's important to make that distinction between weather and climate, like when we have a cold snap like we're going to have this week, that is weather and doesn't necessarily negate longer term warming becomes an important distinction to make. So there are analogies I love that are something like, for those of you who are sports fans, climate can be a batting average and weather is a single at bat. Climate is the clothes in your closet. Weather is the outfit you pick that day. Climate is your personality. Weather is your mood. These are all great ways to set up those relationships and help people understand what you mean by these sort of shorter term variations or the longer term trends and patterns. So climate is also interesting because weather is really kind of what's happening right now or maybe in the very near future. When we think about what climate is what has happened in the past, right? It's all of the data we have for the past weather. Everything from our temperature measurements from the last, 150 years or so, to ice cores that help us see back hundreds of thousands of years. That past data lets us understand climate of the past. Climate is also things that are happening in the present, right? There are large sort of climate forcings at work. These are sometimes called teleconnections, where the global weather patterns are forced by things that are happening in certain parts of the globe. One of the big drivers of weather patterns in North America is ocean temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, right? So those teleconnections are climate forcings that set up our current weather, and they're happening right now. And then, of course, climate is the future, right? What is the future state of our patterns, our weather to come? And that's where we're looking at longer term trends and climate change. So, climate is past, present, and future, and really could be long in the past or long in the future. Or it could be 100 years ago and 100 years from now. I'm probably not, telling you all something much that you don't know, but just to put some words in your mouth that can help you explain things too. Um, Our climate on this planet is driven by greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere. Greenhouse gases by themselves are not a bad thing. We need them. If we didn't have them, we would be like the moon, where it's super hot on one side, super cold on the other side, and unsustainable for life. So we need something to keep that solar radiation near us so that it can be warm enough for us to live comfortably. Um, the problem, of course, becomes when human activities put more of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and thus we keep more of that energy radiating both across the atmosphere and down to the ground. Warms us up on the ground, warms the atmosphere above us as well. So, our concern, of course, is that human activities are adding to the greenhouse effect. And that is it's a simple chemical equation, but that simple chemistry is causing the warming that we're experiencing. Um, we know that carbon dioxide is increasing. We also know it's increasing due to human activity. We can look at recent trends and see that rise coming, and we can compare it to 800,000 years in the past and see how these glacial and interglacial periods had a fluctuation in carbon dioxide really kind of contained for so many years, um, right up until the Industrial Revolution when the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere skyrocketed. It's nearly doubled in concentration since um, that relative sort of stability or range of stability that we had prior to the Industrial Revolution. And it's really as simple as this: more molecules of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more radiation coming back to the ground and to its fellow molecules elsewhere in the atmosphere, and that causes the warming that we have. Um, Carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas, and others are increasing as well, again, due to human activities. Methane is a really big culprit. Methane also is caused quite often by human emissions, our activities putting methane in the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide is another one. Nitrous oxide is great if you're at the dentist and need some work done, but in the atmosphere, it is a greenhouse gas and also can do the same thing as carbon dioxide. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas, way more efficient at radiating that warmth back down to the ground and to the other molecules of the atmosphere. Luckily for us, it's in a much lower concentration in the atmosphere. Um, Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas and one that has been around for a long time. But water vapor cycles through the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, methane, those take a long time to come back out once they're in there, thousands or more years. Water vapor works on cycles that are much shorter, more on the order of days. So water vapor does cause warmer temperatures in the atmosphere, but its behavior is a little different from the other greenhouse gases. So, as probably all of you know, and you've probably all seen these graphics before, global temperatures are increasing. This is the most obvious and the most discussed, DISCUSSED, not discussed like you, that's disgusting, but the most obvious and most discussed impact of climate change. Really easy to visualize this and relatively easy to measure. So it gets a lot of attention. Of course, one of the problems with saying global temperatures are increasing And putting up a scale like this, where the average temperature is increased by a couple of degrees Fahrenheit, in the scale of global temperatures, that's huge. Look how big that difference is now compared to the 1940s, compared to, say, the 1880s. But 2 degrees doesn't mean much to people. If you tell me that the temperature went from 76 to 78 degrees outside, I'm probably not going to really be able to feel the difference. So, to those who are not studying climate change to the same extent or don't think it's a problem, they're thinking about that global average temperature and putting it in the same context as their daily temperatures, right? What big deal is it if it's 52 degrees instead of 50 degrees? That's not that big of a difference. So why should I care? How could that be causing big, disasters like floods and droughts and wildfires? How can such a small change make such a big difference? So while this is an easy measure to make, and these graphics visually show you quite a bit about how our temperatures are changing, for those of you who are sharp-eyed, you might have caught I'm wearing a necklace with the climate stripes, the climate warming stripes on it. Um, Practically, in our minds, it doesn't mean that much. So why do we care so much about global average temperatures when really we're just talking about a couple degrees difference? We'll come back to that in just a moment. Another point I'd like to make is that you can only explain our warming when you include those increased greenhouse gases. That has been shown by people's models for decades and decades now, that you can't replicate what's happening to our temperatures unless you include the greenhouse gases into the simulations. So the Earth is running a fever, and that's maybe a good analogy to this. There's not a lot of difference between 98.6 and 100.6. If you walk outside on a day that's 98.6 degrees or a day that's 100.6 degrees, going to feel hot either way. But I can tell you in my own body, 100.6 degrees feels a whole lot different from 98.6 degrees. And that's because my system is in equilibrium at 98.6. At 100.6, something's wrong. Small change, big difference, right? So speaking of some other symptoms, there's a poster that shows 10 indicators of a warming world. There are actually really these 11 indicators of a warming world. Surface temperatures, like what we showed, that temperature curve, is just one of those, and an important one. It's the one perhaps that we feel the most, but it is only one symptom of many that show us that the climate is changing. We also see warming in our ocean temperatures, both at the surface and in the deep ocean heat. Sea levels are rising. The temperature of the air over the oceans is rising. Humidity is rising. And air temperature really in the troposphere or between the surface and some higher levels of the atmosphere, also warming. And things that are frozen are decreasing. Glaciers, snow cover, and sea ice. The interesting one, the one that I added up at the top, is that the stratosphere is cooling. And I love doing a demonstration when I'm working with a group. I'm going to try and do just a little demo of it now. But if I'm a molecule of carbon dioxide, I radiate in all directions. I'm very excited when I hit this, when the sunlight hits me, right? When that radiation hits me. So I'm radiating down through my feet, I'm radiating out through my fingers, and I'm radiating out through the top of my head. So as I radiate down through my feet, and well, you can't really see them, but they're moving, I promise. That's what's warming the ground. When I'm radiating out to my sides here, this is what's warming the air near me. In other words, the troposphere, or the air just above the ground. But I'm also radiating out of the top of my head. And that goes out into space and looks like cooling. So that's why the stratosphere is cooling and we're warming in all of these other directions. By the way, it's really fun to get a group of people and start with maybe 2 or 3 people and be your molecules of carbon dioxide, and keep adding people maybe in the room, bring them up to the front with you. And they, go like this, and they kind of can't help but bump into each other. And that's how you can show people that putting those extra molecules of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means that they're in contact with each other more. They're sharing their radiation with each other and getting each other all energized. And thus, They are able to pass that energy from molecule to molecule more and pass more energy down to the ground below them. Fun demonstration with a group, works with kids, works with teachers. I don't know if it works with like Thanksgiving aunts and uncles. I've never tried it. But here's the thing, and maybe this slide is the punchline for me of why I care about just a couple of degrees of warming. It doesn't sound like much when it's global temperatures, but the reason I care is that graphic at the upper right. If you take our temperature and our temperature distribution over time and move that just a little bit so that the average moves a couple of degrees, what happens in the middle is that, okay, the average warms a couple degrees. We still sort of feel all the same averages. But what happens at the ends is really where the important stuff happens, right? It isn't the everyday sort of near average stuff we worry about. It's the extremes. We worry about extreme cold. We worry about extreme heat. We worry about extreme precipitation on the dry and wet side. So as we warm that curve up, right, we get a much higher chance of getting that hot weather that's dangerous, that hot weather that causes health problems, um, that hot weather that happens where it wasn't happening very much before and people aren't used to it. Like a few years ago when there was a heat wave up in the Pacific Northwest, it was the hottest weather they had ever had. And one of the reasons it was such a problem there is because that part of our country is really pretty temperate. So a lot of their buildings and structures, their homes, don't have air conditioning. So when they experience that hot extreme, they don't have the means to cool down like we do here. Around here, we're all pretty good about having air conditioning. And even in the cities, there are places that will open up as cooling shelters for vulnerable people. Where my mom lives in northern Michigan, nobody has air conditioning. They don't even have window units. So when extreme heat happens there, which it does more often than it used to, um, they don't really have the means to cool themselves down in their homes, except for leaving the house to go cool down in a lake or something. So it's that's the reason I have such concern about those changes because of what happens to the extremes, because the extremes are where we feel climate changing. I'm actually going to, I borrowed this from a climate change communication expert, Ed Maibach from George Mason University. There are 5 messages about climate change. It is real. It is us. Experts agree. It is mostly bad, and it's not too late to fix it. Now, Ed's version said it's bad. I put the mostly in there because among all of the impacts of climate change that will cause greater expense, greater deaths, greater illnesses and injuries, there are a couple where the impacts are offsetting, or I guess a positive, if you will. So I don't like using it's bad like everything else is absolutely bad, because that's not quite true. It is, however, more bad than good, more expensive, and more likely to hurt more people. So to me, that's pretty bad anyway. But it's not too late to fix it. It's never too late to fix it. It just gets harder and more expensive to fix it the longer we wait. Um, but it's never too late to start, and it's never too little to start trying. So we know this. And I probably haven't told you all stuff you don't know. And if I have and I've glossed over it, please let me know. I love answering questions about it. But now what? Right? If we know this, we accept that the climate is changing. We accept that it's more harm than good, and it could negatively affect ourselves, our families, our communities, the things we care about, and places we care about, and people we care about. Well, now what? Um, well, now we have to start talking about the solutions, because people don't like hearing messages of all of the bad without hearing something they can do to make it better. People will actually shut down. Even people who care quite a bit about climate change will shut down without information about solutions and ways that we can help and ways that we can work toward fixing the problem. So it's a serious problem, but it isn't a hopeless problem. It just requires action at all of these levels. It requires that sort of personal or family action, your own self and your own household. It requires community action where some of us can get together and do some projects together, pursue some changes together. And it does also require solutions that are at the scale of a nation or even at the global scale. All of these are important pieces. Um, the scale of them will feel a bit different. I don't think I could fairly say to you that if you would just recycle and maybe take your bike instead of your car a couple times a week, that that's enough. But what I can say is that it contributes to the solution and it normalizes the solution. You ride your bike, somebody else sees you. Maybe then they ride their bike. Maybe they weren't sure about it until they saw someone else do it, and then they know they can too. Um, it helps us align our actions with our values, which I also understand is pretty important. As a personal example, I only fly if I absolutely have to because I know how much more, how much how much greater the emissions are for flying compared to any other means of transportation. So when it's at all possible and I'm not outright banned from flying, I will fly. I will drive myself, even if it's a very long drive, um, because it's better. But do I fly if I have to? I do. And I myself can't change the nation's flight systems. I can't create a network of high-speed, efficient trains to replace air travel. I can patronize what there is, and I can advocate for those solutions at greater scales than myself. But when it comes to just me, I make the personal choices that I can. And none of us is going to make every choice as something that is always the lowest carbon solution. I'm not a vegetarian, for instance. I reduce the amount of meat that I eat, but I don't cut it out. I will try to make better choices at restaurants, but I don't always. Sometimes I just really crave a steak because I am an omnivore, as most humans are. Um, but if I can reduce those impacts, if I can source my beef locally, if I can do things that make it a little bit better, then those little steps are good. But I also think it's really important to make choices that will have a broader impact too, right? To vote in ways that will support the changes I hope to see, for example, to write letters, to donate to organizations that are doing work at larger scales than I can do on my own. And it's that combination of actions that all contribute to solutions. I know that some folks can feel sort of on the extremes of the personal choices. Either, what good is it if I just do these things because I'm just a drop in the bucket? Or on the other extreme, I'm going to harp on every choice because we have to do everything right. If we do the best we can most of the time and set those examples for our neighbors, our children, our friends, our family members, then we're making those steps in the right direction and hopefully influencing some of the choices other people around us will start to make too. Um, I'm going to pop into chat really quick and see. Um, oh, there. Sorry. Just want to make sure there's no questions coming in that I can't answer. Um,
There is one at the end of the chat.
okay. So it's if we are in total conflict, how are we to change switching from fossil fuels to solar, for example, legislation or moderation, right? So we can change our own selves to the extent that it is feasible for us to do. Not all of us can afford every change we want to make. I would love to install solar panels on my home, but I am not in a financial position to do that right now. I can't do it. So that's not a choice I'm going to make. I do have to replace my car sometime in the next year or two. I will replace it with a hybrid or electric vehicle. That's a choice I can make. So it's sort of not an either or, it's a make the choices you can, to me at least, and make them at all scales, right? I can make my own choices where possible. I can work with my community where possible. I can try to influence where our country is going by votes, by writing letters, by joining larger groups or donating to larger causes, for example. I'm going to keep going just a bit because this last bit is one of the things I like to talk about the most, and that is how do I or how do we talk about climate change? And in this climate that we're in, and I don't mean the weathery type climate, I mean the political climate around us. How do we keep talking about climate change when it seems to be getting harder? I'm going to start with this little chart here and give you a bit of background about it. So, this is research that's been done for decades now by the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication. They have a survey they've been using for decades that asks populations around the country a series of questions that assess their I don't like using the word belief in climate change or global warming. It isn't a belief system. It's science and evidence. So I prefer the language that how much people have accepted the evidence of climate change or global warming, how concerned they are about it, and how motivated they are to make changes because of it. And from their data, they have created 6 categories of Americans that range from this alarmed and concerned category down to the doubtful and dismissive category. Those who are alarmed, very, very engaged in climate change. They understand it, they accept the evidence, they are very, very motivated to make changes. In some cases, the alarmed folks can actually push almost to the point of despair. So it's a group we need to be careful with and take care of because we don't want to take people who are already understanding about climate change and push them to despair when we talk about it. This is why it's important to talk about the solutions so that folks know that there is still action that we can take. The concerned category are folks that accept the evidence. They generally think things, might not be great because of climate change. They may or may not have taken action, though. This is a group that, you know, yeah, I think it might be a problem someday, but I don't know if I want to buy a car that is a hybrid or a plug-in. That seems really inconvenient. Um, but they're listening and they're understanding. We get to the cautious group. That's a group that's like, okay, I think there might be something to this. I'm listening. Maybe tell me more and we'll see if there's something I can do about it. The disengaged group, it's getting smaller and smaller. By the way, in general, from the disengaged to the alarmed group, people have been shifting in that direction. So, shifting from disengaged to cautious to concerned to alarmed. Disengaged is shrinking a little, cautious shrinking a little bit, alarmed and concerned rising. The disengaged are the folks who just don't have the bandwidth to be concerned about climate change. They are folks that are literally just trying to survive. For the most part, these are folks who are very, very low income, very, very high stress lives, um, just trying to survive and have enough to eat for the day, right? They don't have the time to process what's going on. The doubtful category doesn't totally think that things are changing or that it's a problem or that humans are the cause. They are reluctant to believe that there's anything that we need to do to change things, and they are not likely making changes right now in their lives. But they're not quite as far over as the dismissive category. The dismissive category is what I like to call the troll category. These are the ones who do not think that climate is changing, or if they do, it is not humans, or if it's humans, there's nothing we can do about it. Um, they are not concerned at all about making changes. In fact, they believe strongly we should not be making changes or worrying about it in any way. That is a vocal group, but I want you to look at those numbers again. 11%. That number fluctuates from 9 to 11, and it has throughout the history of this, but it has always been about 9 to 11%, which means about 90% of Americans are at least open to having a discussion about climate change. It feels like a lot, right? It feels like there are a lot of people in that dismissive category. And there are, depending on where you are and what groups you're talking to. I mean, certainly this group probably doesn't follow that percent distribution in the six Americas, right? This group is probably more over into the alarmed and concerned categories because you showed up on a Sunday night. This is a subject you care about. If I walked into a group of, let's say, oil and gas drillers, probably hard over into the doubtful and dismissive category side or disengaged. So, yes, what group you're talking to, what subgroup of Americans definitely can change. But America overall, only 10% of people are really not going to ever change their minds. 90% of Americans are at least willing to listen. And I think that's an important message because it is so hard to have those conversations sometimes. And when I find that I'm in a conversation with somebody in that dismissive category, how I respond to them is important to me, not because I think I can change their mind. I am never going to change the mind of somebody in the dismissive category. What I do worry about is that somebody who's over here cautious, disengaged, or doubtful is listening. And they're not only listening to the science I know, they're listening to how I'm engaged. Am I being polite? Am I saying things that make sense to them? Am I relating it to something they care about? So, humans have a number of cognitive biases. One of them is the confirmation bias, which is we are much more likely to believe the facts and evidence that intersect with our own belief systems, our own value systems. That is true of all humans. There is not a human out there that hasn't had some confirmation bias. How much we recognize it and accept it can vary from human to human. Um, but what is important to remember is people get their belief and value systems throughout their whole lives and are influenced by people they trust. So if we are going to give a different perspective that's outside of their belief systems, am I somebody who's close enough to them that they're going to change their belief systems for me? Probably not. So I need to look for those pieces of evidence that will intersect with their belief systems. Where can I get into that sweet spot, that zone where they are listening because I have found something that's in their belief system? And how much am I myself making sure that I'm staying open to facts and evidence, even if they fall outside of my belief system as well? Because I'm a human too, and I have confirmation bias just like every one of us. One of the strategies I have learned and used is that strategy of creating a narrative. And by narrative, I actually mean a whole story, right? Going back to your high school English classes or college English classes where you have protagonists, antagonists, uh, beginning, middle, and end, some kind of conflict and resolution. You have a setting in place and time. What is the story you tell about climate change? Now, the cool thing about my story with Laura Ingalls Wilder is I didn't actually have to write the story. I'm just borrowing hers because she's a trusted protagonist. And in her books, the weather itself is often the antagonist. So I also get the opportunity to use an antagonist that's already there. Um, so through that perspective of what has happened to this character, this writer that is beloved by so many people, I have the ability to say, she wrote a lot of great information. She was pretty accurate in her facts. That's great. That's going to go back to this confirmation bias for folks who um, maybe remember those stories fondly or believe that Laura Ingalls Wilder lived in a place and time that was more idealized to them. They're nostalgic for it, whatever the reasons. But I can verify her trusted voice and then add to the story by creating this conflict and resolution, right? This conflict with the weather, this resolution of what she learned, what we can learn from it. When people are listening to a story, the story is effective if they trust the narrator or the protagonist. So in my case, they might trust Laura Ingalls Wilder. They don't have to trust me. I'm just here to tell Laura's story. Or maybe they trust me, and that's a good way to get that too. But the story will be more effective if the listeners trust that storyteller. Of course, it will be more effective if they can relate to it. They can understand it. It's something similar to their experience. It's something they have experienced or want to experience. It's a place that's familiar, a time period they know or want to go back to. And if the story is so compelling that it transports them, right? Have you ever read a book or binge watched something on Netflix and you had no idea how much time had passed because you were transported by the story? That is a hard thing to achieve. If it was easy, more people would write books. uh, but if the story is so compelling, full of tension, waiting for that resolution, for something that you care about, readers can be transported by that. Listeners can be transported by that story. And then they want that story. They're most effectively going to remember what's in it if it has what's called congruence, meaning what they see in the protagonist reflects what they see as sort of their ideal self or what they want to be. So the hero of the story is doing something that they want to do. The hero of the story is, making a bunch of money, solving a big problem, something like that, that aligns with their own values. Um, so one of my favorite parts of the Laura Ingalls Wilder story is why was the long winter so cold? And it was cold for a few meteorological reasons. For those who love weather of the past, there was a pattern in place that made much of North America cold that winter. A similar pattern actually set up in the winter of 2009 to 10. And if you were in Lincoln that winter, you might remember there were several December blizzards. It was very, very cold and snowy in December and January. And there was a record long duration of a snowpack actually from December through February. And then it let up. And in February, we got back to normal and things eased up again, which is an interesting story because it was very, very similar um, of a weather pattern between the winter of 1880 to 81 and the winter of 2009 to 10. So why was the winter of 1880 to 81 the long winter and the winter of 2009 to 10 kind of ended on time? Well, one of the reasons is that the climate was so much colder in the 1880s. When those same pattern perturbations or changes happened on a colder background climate, it's able to drive that climate, that winter, colder for longer than it can right now. You have to work harder, a lot harder, to get just as cold in this decade as you did in the 1880s. That's a story I get to tell to people when I talk about the long winter. Another strategy you can use is to frame the subject. And I don't mean I was framed, I was set up. I mean it in a storytelling sense. And all that it means is telling a story that is relatable to the person you're talking to. I think this is maybe the most important part of the communication. What is it that the person or the group you're talking to cares about? What is that value? Is it that they are a farmer or rancher and want to continue to farm uh, in that location or want their children to continue to farm in that location for another generation to come? What you're talking about then is sustainability, but you don't have to use the words climate change and sustainability. You can use the language that says, if you would like to keep farming in this location, are there things that are going to have to change? Are you going to have to change what you grow or how you rotate your crops? That's framing the story. You can frame it around economic growth. You can frame it around the children are our future. We want to protect them and make their world better. You can frame climate change around national power. Don't we want to be a leader? Don't we want to be the first ones to the moon, the first ones solving this problem? Um, that's a good one in my mind, by the way, when folks want to say that, well, why should America do anything about climate change if, China and India are also really big emitters of carbon dioxide? Don't we want to be a leader, or do we want to wait and be third in line behind China and India? I don't know. Innovation here in America sure sounds great to me. That's what I mean by framing the story. We find the thing that the other group values and have that conversation. I also think that it isn't always important to get people to accept and verbalize that climate change is caused by human activities, as long as they're moving toward a solution or a lower carbon solution. As a scientist, I want everybody to get it. Um, as someone who cares deeply about the planet and cares deeply about being safe from weather extremes in the future, I really want people to know why so they know what to do. But when I was in the National Weather Service issuing tornado warnings, it wasn't important to me that people understood why a tornado formed where it did. In that moment, I just wanted people to go to the basement and take shelter. And I think of climate change in the same way. I don't necessarily need people to understand why, if they're willing to take the action that will protect themselves safe, keep their communities safe. Because that's really the ultimate goal for me. That's my value. Your values might be different. What you want to communicate might be different. But for me, if I can get people to take that protective action, that's where I'm hoping to make that impact. One last strategy I will mention is the strategy of repeating the consensus and not the myth. Mythbusters, right? That's a fun show to watch. Um, and I often get asked by folks who work in my agency, my organization, can't you put like a Mythbusters document up? Like, here's the myth and here's the reality. And I don't want to do it because when you repeat a myth, even if it's to debunk it, you reinforce it. It is better to repeat the consensus, repeat the thing we know. And there's a great book out there called Foolproof that will talk about pre-bunking, which means before something gets out in the world that gets a sticky message, you might hear somebody say that this winter was cold, and it was a cold winter, and that doesn't change the fact that the planet is warming. What I'm doing in that is pre-bunking without saying the myth is that a cold winter means that climate isn't changing. Because there I just said a cold winter means that climate isn't changing, and that's a sticky message in people's minds. You might hear somebody say that it was cold this winter, and that does not mean that the climate or that can still, sorry, I'm going to rephrase myself because this is hard to do in real time. The climate is still warming even when we have a cold winter. That's the message you want to get across, right? That's the fact there. So reinforcing the facts and making them sticky is much more effective than using that sort of myth buster and debunk model that feels like it should work, but it doesn't. So, a couple of personal actions you can also take. One is to become part of the observations network. You can be an observer. Everybody can be an observer in the CocoRouse system. You buy a plastic gauge. It's the same gauge used as everybody else in the system and observe precipitation. They are recorded, archived, and used by climate experts and researchers, folks who are trying to answer questions. And you get access to educational webinars and materials too if you're a CocoRouse observer. So that's one way to participate in the science. Great way to engage kids in the science, to become part of understanding the atmosphere. I think it's really important to get out there and observe what's going on and really pay attention to that world in your backyard, in your neighborhood. And this is one way to do that, to get out there every day and see what's going on. There's also the National Phenology Network, if you're a person who likes to bird watch, for example, or watch for leaf emergence or flower emergence, insects arriving, things like that. There's a citizen contribution component where you can track the changes in certain plants and animals from where you are and help see if leaves are emerging extra early this year or apple tree buds are emerging extra early, which means that if we got a freeze after they emerge, then that could be destructive to the crop. Maybe be a monarch butterfly tracker and understand how their migration patterns are changing. By tracking the behavior of plants and animals, we can often follow patterns where human influences, including climate change as well as land use and other things, are affecting the systems around us, the ecology around us. I'm also going to put this up, and I'm going to put this on my last slide, which is next here too. But these are 4 books that I have for recommended reading. All We Can Save, but it's a collection of essays edited by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson. Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. That actually might be my favorite one by Catherine Hayhoe. The Climate Optimist Handbook. I will admit I have not really read this yet. I have followed Anna Therese Ganari's email newsletters and such, and I enjoy her writing style. So I think I'm excited to get this book and read it. I think it's going to be a good one. And then The Thinking Person's Guide to Climate Change by Robert Henson, a great book for climate sort of science information and background, so you feel more comfortable talking about it. I really am looking forward to some discussion and questions here, and I see that they're queuing up, so I will come to them. While we're discussing those, I'll leave this up so you have my email address. Please, you are welcome to email me if you'd like and have any questions. I also have a Substack where I write on different weather and climate related topics every couple weeks. It's not too often, and you can ask and answer questions on that as well. So that was it for my sort of prepared slides and ready remarks. And with that, I'm going to go back and look at the questions that I've queued up and see if the moderators have anything they want to start with also.
Thank you, Barb. Great presentation. I think you touched on a lot of the key issues that are of interest, not just to me, but obviously our audience as well. While we're transitioning to some questions, could you just elaborate a bit on the distinction between adaptation and mitigation? Because there is a lot of confusion about that terminology amongst lay people in particular. So maybe you can give us your perspective on that.
Absolutely. So adaptation means there are changes that are happening. So I'm going to change something about how I live and what I do to accommodate those changes. Adaptation might mean I take out flood insurance, and even though I had never had to before, because river levels are rising or floods are happening more often. Or if I lived in California, perhaps wildfire insurance, right? That's one adaptation measure. Um, in a wildfire environment, adaptation might look like pulling up vegetation close to your house and changing your landscape so that you're using less flammable materials in your yard so that your house is safer from wildfires. Around here, adaptation might look like um, installing a heat pump in your home so that you are using more of a more efficient energy source, which actually is going to be a bit of a mitigation step too. Mitigation means I am actively trying to do something to either put less greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere or to take them back out again. Mitigation means things like um, changing over to renewable energy sources, like putting solar on the house or a full energy network incorporating wind power into its network. Mitigation can look like um, purchasing an electric vehicle instead of a traditional combustion engine vehicle, for example. So adaptation means I will adapt to the changes that are coming. Mitigation means I'm going to try to change it in some way. I see a question in the chat. I see several questions in the chat, and some of them are really, really good. Um,
Let you pick and choose.
all right. So, with the current administration and its seeming alignment with fossil fuels, what avenues do we have as individuals to contribute to helping curtail the progression of climate change? Mitigation steps that we can take include the things I just mentioned, right? Using electric vehicles instead of gas-powered ones, carpooling, riding on bikes sometimes instead of using your own vehicles, encouraging your neighbors to do the same, getting kids to do a project that's perhaps related to that, get a kid's bike day or, try to talk the school system into a bike to school day. In my school system, it's actually not allowed for kids to ride their bikes to school. They don't have any place to lock them up, and they don't allow them to be parked at the school. Maybe that's the kind of change you can make to advocate to your school system the importance of letting kids ride their bikes to school. It might mean contacting your energy company and letting them know that you support their incorporating of renewable resources into the energy network. It might mean writing letters to your representatives at various levels, from local to national, and letting them know that this is an issue that's important to you. Um, it is, it feels harder and it is harder depending on where national leadership wants to go, but it doesn't mean that actions are out of reach. What it does mean is that when the national leadership is not aligned with your values, you have to look more to that local and community level and start there with your changes. Find your neighbors who want the same things, like you have here. This is a great community you have with each other, right? What can this community do when they get together?
Barb, before we go to the next question, I just wanted to emphasize the importance of incentives as a motivational tool to get people to move to more fuel efficient automobiles, heating, air conditioning systems, etc. And these incentives can occur at the local level, at the state level, or at the national level, and really can be a driving force in promoting more energy efficient actions. So,
Yes, because let's face it, some of the solutions cost money, and not all of us have extra cash laying around to put into it. So incentives are really effective at getting people who maybe were on the fence to go ahead and make those changes. All right, I like this question, so I'm going to do it next. I am mystified and interested in my perspective why Nebraska is so economically dependent on climate for production agriculture and yet consistently votes for climate change deniers. And somebody else said there's a million of us who want the answer to that question. Here are some of the reasons why. Um, One of the reasons actually stems back to the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl era, and the arrival of FDR. When FDR's New Deal programs came, they incentivized practices that farmers didn't particularly want to follow, like destroying harvests to bring food costs and production costs more into balance. Um, those policies caused Great Plains farmers to dislike and distrust the New Deal. Not all of them, of course, I am generalizing, but a majority. And that was a sentiment that lingered after the New Deal in this region. So the New Deal, of course, was associated with FDR and the emerging liberal, what is now Democratic Party in the United States. And although it has not been universal, in some states more than others, that distrust has lingered, where the farmers wanted to just be left alone to sell their crops and do what they wanted, and they didn't like being told by the government what they had to do with their stuff. So there might be a bit of that, independent mindset and streak that underlies it too. I will tell you that I have interacted with a number of farmer groups in Nebraska, and that is definitely one of those groups where you don't want to talk to them about why things are changing, and you're never going to get them to admit that they need to do different in emissions or vote differently. But when you talk one-on-one with those farmers, do they recognize that things are changing? Yes, they do. That's a pretty universal yes. They recognize that growing seasons are changing. And are they willing to make changes at their farm level to at least adapt to that? Yes. Politically, will they change the way they vote ever? I don't know. I'm one of, it's a million and one who want to know the answer to that question. I don't pretend to be very good at forecasting people. I'm okay at forecasting weather. I understand climate. People are a lot harder. But I think it's important to reach people in the value systems where they are. And when you're interacting with the agriculture sector in Nebraska, they understand that changes are happening and for the most part are wanting to do something to make their farms more sustainable for the future. Should we try to go back to small farms, smaller crops, diversification? Ecologically, that is a very sound choice. Ecologically, it is more sustainable. Um, Economically, would we ever be able to go back in that direction? I don't know. It's not really sustainable to farm corn in central and western Nebraska, especially as the Ogallala aquifer level drops and irrigation becomes more and more difficult. And the climate in western Nebraska is drying a little faster than here in eastern Nebraska. Would diversification help them still be able to have a productive farm when corn crops are not doing so well? Yeah, of course. Um, but there's sometimes not a lot of economic motivation to do that. So, um, while I think it would be a useful exercise to explore and talk about more, I think it would require a pretty healthy systematic change in agriculture that would, I think it would need to be connected to some version of an economic benefit for it to really stick. Do I receive federal funds for my work and is my work in jeopardy? I am a federal civil servant with climate in my title. I'll let you take it from there.
That's depressing in itself, right? So,
Yeah.
okay. Um, are there other questions that pop out to you, or do you want me to
There's
choose one?
there's one last one that popped out to me, and it was, I think, back in the beginning, and I'm looking for it. How do we open a conversation with a climate denier? Where do you start? You start with what's important to them. And again, that hard over 10% probably not going to change their mind. I wouldn't open the conversation with them. You're just going to frustrate yourself. But if you're talking about someone else who's more in the I don't really want to believe it, but maybe, they're willing to have the conversation. It's opening it with things they care about. And I'll give you an example. My son's on a baseball team, and there is a wide range of perspectives among the parents of the kids on that team. One of the parents and I had a conversation at a team party, and both of us had had a couple drinks, so we're both pretty, loose-tongued and ready to have a good conversation. And he was on this, I want to say he was somewhere around cautious, maybe leaning doubtful, where, yeah, maybe something's changing, but I don't want someone to tell me I can't eat meat. And I don't want someone to tell me what I have to drive. So that's an opening to a conversation. Great. You don't want to change eating meat? Okay, I don't either. I like meat. Maybe sometimes can you choose chicken instead of beef? Because on the scale of what has more impact to the carbon emissions, chicken's a better choice. You don't have to do it all the time. Have a steak sometimes, but maybe once in a while when you're at the restaurant and you're kind of on the fence of what sounds good, let that be the deciding factor. Do you have to change what you drive? You don't have to change what you drive, but isn't it more expensive to fill up that really big truck? I don't know about you, but for me, I would like to have something that's less expensive to drive. You can make your own choices, but when you make them, you know what choices cost you more money. And, isn't it great when there are two benefits to a choice, something that costs less and is a little better for the world around us? I keep my thermostat at 80 degrees during the day in the summer. Is it uncomfortably warm? Sometimes, but it's a whole lot cheaper and keeps money in my pocket. It's the flip side of it for winter. My house is 62 degrees in the winter during at night or when I'm not home, especially. Is it chilly? Yeah, it's chilly. So I put on another sweater and snuggle up under some blankets. I think people are afraid of being told what to do. And that may be more true in Nebraska than some other parts of the country. Helping people understand that they still get to make choices and that the choices benefit them directly. It's not just about save the planet, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, but not everybody's. Um, it's sometimes about save money, by the way, or, you know, maybe just when on the fence about a decision, that can be one of the factors that swings you. And I think for that person, that was actually a very convincing conversation to them. Um, for your uncle at the Thanksgiving table, maybe the thing that convinces them is giving a big old middle finger to China. Maybe the thing that convinces them is having more money in their pocket. You know the person that you're talking to, and I think that is the place to start those conversations. What is the thing that is their hang up? And if you're not sure, ask, right? What would it take for you to feel more comfortable about climate change information? What would be that piece of information that would compel you to buy the hybrid instead of the combustion engine? And then listen to their answer.
So Barb, you talked about one of the reasons we care about this issue is the implications for our children and our grandchildren and so forth. Um, I just might mention to the group that we asked Barb to make a presentation at our Youth Climate Summit last fall. And that was the sixth Youth Climate Summit. So the importance of engaging our youth, particularly high school and college students, to sort of develop or motivate that passion that they have to become involved, to become advocates for change, not just to vote, but also to talk to elected officials and so on. I don't know what your experience has been with that, Barb, besides the involvement in our Youth Climate Summit last fall, but maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
I can expand on that some. One of the niches I have filled is not so much interacting with students, but interacting with teachers. Um, Teachers are the best force multiplier to reach children. And I have worked with several different teacher groups to help them both gain more information about climate change so they feel more sound in their science to talk about it, but also to build their confidence in having conversations about climate change or having lessons about climate change, um, even in places where the parents maybe are not as open and accepting to those conversations. So in the interactions I've had with teachers, part of it is about helping them feel more confident and firm about teaching it, and also helping them reach the children. It is important with kids, just like adults, maybe even more so than adults, to talk about solutions with the problems. Kids are very susceptible at all ages. I mean, little kids all the way up to teenagers and college students are susceptible to feeling powerless in the face of a very big problem. Um, so helping them understand the steps they can take, here's something you can do here at school, here in your home, here in your community, so that as they are learning what climate change is and the problems it can cause, that they are also learning solutions too.
Barb, there's another question that just came in. It's at the bottom of the chat list.
I actually see two that I want to address, so let me get to
Okay,
both of them.
okay, go
One
for
of
it.
them is that you say it's not too late to fix climate change. Are you sure? Many think we should now be in the adaptation stage. That is a great question. And the answer is it is a both and. We are baked into some changes that will happen even if every carbon dioxide emission around the globe shut off today. So, yes, we need to look at adaptation to the changes that are coming. But there is still a continuous off ramp into less impacts the sooner we work to mitigate climate change by reducing fossil fuel emissions and looking into ways to bring carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. So it is both and it is too late for there to be no changes whatsoever. But it is not too late to reduce the changes in the future. The next question down at the bottom here, the planet is billions of years old. We can presume there have been cyclic climate changes over this extensive period of time, which could have lasted thousands of years. I'll add even millions of years. Many might recall that where we lived was once tropical and part of an inland sea. Most of us lack the celestial knowledge that might influence our climate changes too. Yes, you're absolutely right. Climate has changed on lots of scales through the planet's 4.5 billion year history. There are a number of solar type cycles, and I don't mean like the 11-year sunspot cycle. That's actually a very, very small contributor. I mean like orbital cycles. And, those could be on the scales of tens of thousands of years to hundreds of thousands of years or longer that do influence the planet's climate. And you're absolutely right. Even tectonic plate movement influences our climate, right? These plates have not been in the same place throughout the planet's history. So as those moves happen and an actual tectonic plate shifts from something closer to the equator to something closer to the poles, that also influences the climate. There are definitely those factors there. Um, Gosh, that's almost a whole other lecture. I took an excellent class on it from Dr. Merlin Lawson, who was at UNL. Maybe that's a good one to bring in for the future sometime. Um, but yes, that is one of those attempted gotchas that folks may try to throw in to trip up climate scientists, I guess, to say, aha, but the planet has been warmer before. You're absolutely right. And that's how we know that when there is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the temperature's warm, because people have studied when that planet was warmer millions of years ago and what the conditions were like on the planet at the time, what levels of carbon dioxide were in the atmosphere. Understanding that deep climate history of the Earth is how we know that carbon dioxide and temperatures are so closely connected. And scientists have also spent a lot of time modeling and understanding those orbital cycles and changes. And this is a fun fact, actually. By the orbital cycles, our planet actually should be cooling right now. We should be having a gradual cooling toward the next ice age. And instead, the planet is warming, which means that the amount of warming that is being caused by the extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is over 100% because it's offsetting that warming and adding a whole bunch of, or sorry, it's offsetting that cooling and then adding a whole bunch of warming on top of it. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really helpful to understand that Earth's deep history to better understand where we are today. And as a climatologist, that is one of the best classes I ever took to understand that. And volcanoes can belch a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, right? Yeah, some. It requires planet scale volcanic activity to increase to have a lasting effect. Volcanoes are best known for putting emissions up into the atmosphere for a couple of years after they blow. That has a temporary cooling effect, actually. That's the ash and the soot and stuff that gets up into the high levels of the atmosphere and blocks some of the sun's radiation from getting in. There have been periods in Earth's history where volcanic activity was hotter than it is now, right? There were more volcanoes, they were more active. And in those periods, the volcanoes put some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But by and large, the effects of a volcano in today's climate are temporary. They cause a sort of a hiccup in the curve, but not a permanent alteration to the direction of the change.
Barb, thank you very much for your presentation. I think we're just about out of time. Maybe I'll turn it back to Peter.
Yeah, just for a second. Thank you very much, Barb. This was a great kickoff to our series. And both Barb and Don Wilhite mentioned economic motivations or incentives to approach climate changes, and that's a good segue for next week's speaker, who's going to talk about economic sustainability. So I hope that you tune in next week, talk to your friends, and let's hope that an even wider audience is able to benefit by what we hear on the series. So thank you all for participating. Thank you again, Barb, for your talk and your response to the questions. And we'll see you all next week.